All right, good evening, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started and get settled in here. So if you don't know me, my name is Charles Plemons. If you are visiting with us, we are very, very pleased to have you. Want to let everybody know that we are recording these sessions. They are not going to be live streamed, but they will be available on the church website and on YouTube. So if you miss a class and you want to get caught up, you're able to do so. And just a little bit of housekeeping stuff for tonight. So one of the things that I like to do is create a workbook that has all of the worksheets for the entire quarter available. And if you want a workbook, we'll pass those out in a minute, but also I have worksheets. So if you don't plan to be here for the entire quarter, you're just visiting, or you're just trying to try this out, we have the worksheets if you would rather have those. If you forget your workbook, you're able to get a worksheet each week. I'll try to keep those in stock. So Ashley has been printing for us, and so we are just making a wild guess on how many of these we need. If we need more next week, we will adjust. Now the workbooks have a place where you can put your name on them, so you can write that. And it also has a place where you can write your mailbox number, because you're probably thinking, I will forget my book. Well, this can be very much like a return to high school. Just take it out of here, go to your mailbox, slide it in there, and it's already at the church and ready for you. And you can get caught up on everything that's going on in the church as you go back to your locker, so to speak, and talk to everybody. The workbooks have blanks in them, so very, very simple. It's just each of the slides. I've blanked out some of the words. Now, these are not intended as trick questions. This is just because some people like to write or doodle as they're listening. It kind of helps them pay attention. So it is word for word off of the slides. So please don't get concerned thinking, oh, I've got to pay a whole lot of attention. He's going to try to trip me up. It's right there on the screen. If you are a completionist and you miss a week and you need to come get the answers, come see me. I'll be glad to give those to you. All of the worksheets also have a section called Challenge Yourself. And the Challenge Yourself is something that you can do on your own time. It might be a reflection kind of thing. It could be a word scramble. It could be a puzzle. It could be various different things. So all kinds of stuff in your workbook. The last pages of the workbook is an appendix that has all of the answers to the puzzles. So I'm not trying to stress anybody out. I don't want anybody thinking, I cannot figure out this one word on here. You can flip to the back and get the answers. So, all right. Any questions about the workbook so far? All right, so first of all, who would rather have the worksheet tonight rather than the workbook? Anybody? All right, we got one back here. And if I could get some volunteers to help me pass out all of these workbooks. There you are. Oops. And they are all the same. Thank you. There we are, sir. I do not have any. I thought of everything and obviously did not. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. All right, so right before this class, I was threatened by Landon Bryant. He said that every time I mention that the book of Esther is the only book that does not mention God directly, he was going to tackle me. So, our very first point on the slide. This book is famous for not mentioning God directly. And so I guess I have to watch out for Landon. Fortunately, he found out that he's working security and is not in here tonight. So maybe I can duck him and dodge him, but it is recorded, so he'll probably find out. So I think this is one of the most famous things, most well-known things about this book. If you are doing the trivia kind of questions, that's always the thing, right? What's special about the book of Esther? Well, it doesn't mention God. However, if you read this book, it's very obvious that God is at work, God is at play in this book. He is everywhere if you kind of read between the lines. And that is very, very important for us today because we live in a time where the idea of the flashbang miracle is not happening. You can look through Scripture and God did amazing things. He parted the Red Sea. He raised people from the dead. Very obvious, flashy kind of things. We don't see that today. We're in a different age. And so it's very easy, I think, for people to look around and say, well, is God really active? What is God doing? Well, I think part of the reason we have the book of Esther is so that we have something with which we can relate. Because as we read through this, we're going to see that the people are in situations and God is not actively interacting with them like we see with a lot of the prophets and things like that. He's kind of behind the scenes, and we see how he is still working for their good. Well, that's more like how we interact with God today. We know that he's there. We know that he's active, but we're not seeing these flashy kind of things. We're not having direct conversations where we speak and he speaks back through a burning bush or something like that. So this is an important book for us. And we need to remember that it doesn't really matter if God is named or not, or if God is seen. God is working. And we know that he is working because he's promised us that he is working. He has told us that he is working in our behalf and in our lives. And we get to see that play out here in the book of Esther. Now, when I was talking to Landon and trying to get myself out of being tackled, I told him, I said, could I get out of one tackle free if I can make the argument that God is mentioned in the book of Esther? And he looked at me like he was going to tackle me right there. And he said, oh, you're going to try some kind of trickery or something. And then when he found out he was working security, he said, okay, tell me the secret. Here's the secret. There are two versions of the book of Esther. And so depending on who you are talking with, you might say, oh yeah, that's the book that doesn't mention God. And the person who's looking at you may look at you kind of strange and say, well, yeah, he is. Well, there's a Hebrew version of the text, which we have in our Bibles. That's what we are familiar with, what we've grown up with, what we talk about. But there's also the Greek version of the text. And the Greek version is what you would find in a lot of Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. And guess what is in that version? God. Yes, so it's a longer version. There are a few passages that have been added. So it includes prayers. It includes references to God. So, where did those come from? Why are there two versions? What do we think?
Might have a purpose for beefing it up or adding to it.
Okay, somebody added to it. Yeah, somebody beefed it up. Somebody has added to it. And I'm glad you said that way, beefed it up. Generally, if we talk about beefing something up, is that a positive or a negative? It's generally a positive, right? If I'm going to beef something up, I'm going to improve it. I'm going to make it better. So, somebody along the way looked at this text and thought, I'm going to help God out. I'm going to beef up this text. It was probably done with good intention. It was probably done, and the theory is that it was done by scribes who were copying the book, and they were trying to make explicit what was implied. They were looking at this text and thinking, oh, people are struggling. They're saying that this maybe shouldn't be a book of the Bible. They're saying that God isn't mentioned. Well, right here we know God is involved. So what if we just wrote in here about God? Sounds good, right? Sounds like it had a good intention. But what do we know about adding to the Word of God?
Better not.
Better not. Better not. God had a purpose for the book of Esther being written the way that it was. I just shared one of my theories on it, why it's beneficial for us in this day and age. God had it written in a specific way for a reason. So it was likely added to beef it up, to address some of these concerns of, well, where's God in this book? So, if you end up in that trivia kind of situation, and you say, well, Book of Esther doesn't mention God. Sure, and somebody pulls out a Bible. Now you won't be confused. And well, Charles said that it wasn't. Now you know how that could happen. All right, so let's talk about some history. Before we start reading any of the book, it's helpful to understand what was going on in the world at the time that it was written. And we don't know the exact time frame. We can just kind of guess based on some of the context clues. Now, before we get into the next slide, those of you who have the workbook, there is an appendix, Appendix 1 in your workbook. It's got a timeline in it. There's also a map in here. So I'm a very visual person. I like being able to see kind of where things are. So that's something that you can reference throughout this. But there's a timeline that spells out events that are going on in the world. And so this might be kind of helpful as you are reflecting on this. If you're looking at it later, you'll recognize a lot of events. There's references to books in the Bible where we do have a little bit better idea of an exact date to kind of give us an idea of things going on. So we believe that the events going on at this time place it around 486 to 465 BC. And that's what's reflected in the appendix that you have. So in this time frame, we have to remember that the nation of Israel had been taken into captivity. And, well, Bible trivia, how long were they in captivity before they were allowed to return? Anybody remember? 70 years. That's right. I forgot my stickers. We should have a sticker for Roger there. I'll bring stickers. So about 70 years was the time frame before they were allowed to return. Now, this takes place approximately 100 years. So you might stop and think, well, if we're talking about the book of Esther and this is all going on outside of Israel and the captivity ended after 70 years and 100 years, what's going on here? Well, not everyone who went into captivity, not all of the families, not all the Israelites then returned. There were many Israelites that chose to stay in that land. So we're talking about the people who did not go back after the 70 years. And you'll see that on your timeline in the appendix as well. All right, so when we read this, we're going to be introduced to a king, a Persian king, and his name is Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus. Now, that is a Hebrew name. So when we have reference to Ahasuerus, we can't really go to the Persian records and say, well, which king was it? Because that was not his name in their records. So that's the first bit that makes it a little bit difficult to figure out who this was. Now, the nation of Persia at this time was a massive kingdom. It controlled everything from India to Ethiopia. And if you'll turn to your map there in the appendix, you can see just how big that is. Persian Empire was big. The Persian Empire controlled what we think of as Babylon, Assyria, all these different areas that we read about earlier on in the history of the Israelites. Now we've got this very, very large world power at the time. So very, very big, very, very wealthy. It is a nation of laws, very strange, strict laws, mighty army, and they were known for conquering people. All right, so I mentioned this individual named Ahasuerus. So who in the world is Ahasuerus? So there's debate that rages among scholars as to who this is. And so we're just going to go with what is the most common theory, but we're going to talk about some of the other ones so you're aware that they're out there. So most people identify Ahasuerus with a king named Xerxes the First. And if you look at the dates there, that matches the dates that I mentioned earlier when we were talking about when this happens. So why in the world do we think it was likely Xerxes? So there's a historian who's named Herodotus. And one of the writings of Herodotus talks about the personality of this King Xerxes. And he was noted to have been highly influenced by women and known for making really extravagant or ridiculous, outlandish promises. Now, as we read the text, we're going to find that that really matches the personality of the king that we read about, because women seem to be his downfall. He makes ridiculous promises. He makes decisions over women that just really aren't reasonable. So this very well could be pointing to this king. Now, one of the main characters that we're going to be introduced to in the book of Esther is a Jewish man named Mordecai. Now, Mordecai is not a Jewish name. Mordecai is a Persian name. But there's a reference in the records that we've been able to recover through archaeology of the servants of Xerxes. And one of them is a reference to a Mardukah. And scholars think that that is just another spelling, another rendering of Mordecai. So we do have some evidence from the behavior of Xerxes the First, matches the behavior of the king we read about. And we have this reference to one of his officials that may be pointing to the same individual. Now, some people have differing opinions. There are some theories out there that it could be Artaxerxes, who was his son. That was the next king who took over right after Xerxes. So this was Artaxerxes the First. And then later there was another descendant, Artaxerxes the Second. So you see that gets us all the way possibly to 358 BC. So 60, 70 years later on. So if it was one of those later kings, that shifts our timeline just a little bit. So we're not exactly sure, but we think that it was Xerxes. So the textual clues kind of fit Xerxes the First the best. At the end of the day, it doesn't really truly matter. If God wanted us to know 100% definitively, he would give us enough information. But what we need to learn is about his behavior, the things that he does. We're really just speculating as to which king it was. The nice thing about matching things up with history is being able to prove the Bible and to be able to talk to those who are doubting it. And so when we have these very clear 100% matches, that's great, because we can point to it and say, right here we have all these records. This is obviously an individual who lived. The things that they did are chronicled, and we can prove the Bible with it. This is one of those that's a little bit nebulous as to who specifically it was, but we have enough clues that we can make an educated guess. All right, any thoughts or comments on any of that so far? Okay. All right, so we mentioned this character Xerxes. He's the king. He's a mighty king. He's a very powerful king, and he's known for being warlike and dominating other areas. And his personality matches kind of what you would expect someone who was born into royalty, who's been raised in this environment. He's got warriors at his command. He's got all the wealth of the world at his command. He's not always what we would call reasonable. So he was known, one, for his tremendous pride. He's a very prideful individual. Now, wealth and power does not necessarily mean that one will be prideful. But are we shocked to hear that somebody could be prideful in that situation? I heard kind of a snort from somebody. Of course not. Of course not. We shouldn't be surprised by that. But he's also known for being volatile, or his volatility. What in the world is volatile?
Goes off quickly.
Goes off quickly. Yeah. So like a hand grenade, he's at any time ready to go off. He's not a very stable individual. He can make rash decisions. Now, I know we haven't read any of the book of Esther yet, but those of you who have read it, we talk about the idea of Esther being brave enough to come in, and if the king raises his scepter, she would live. Well, if he didn't raise his scepter, then what? She dies. That seems pretty extreme, right? Does that sound like a volatile kind of individual, a prideful individual? So, again, his kind of personality matches with this king. Now, I want to give you an example of his pride, his volatility, and really some of his unreasonableness. So, Xerxes I waged war against the Greeks. Has anybody ever heard of the Persian and Greek wars? What do we remember about any of those? Anybody seen the movie 300? Came out 20 years ago or so. It's about all these Greek warriors who made this mighty stand. There were only 300 of them, and they held off the Persian army. That's this. So, Xerxes attacks Greece. Greece was one of the other major world powers at the time. And so Xerxes is interested in conquering the Greeks. The Greeks, from a military standpoint, what do we know about them? Were they any good at it? Yeah. Anybody ever heard of Spartan? Yeah, we even talk about Spartan today as being kind of the best of the best. So the Greeks were known as being very well-disciplined, powerful, trained warriors. And so Xerxes, with his mighty army, is going up against the Greeks, trying to conquer them. So he comes to siege this area in Greece, and he has to cross a bit of ocean or sea to get all of his soldiers over there to fight. And so it's not like they had superhighways, so they had a problem. He needed to march his soldiers over there, and they needed to be ready to fight when they got there. So they didn't want to sail them over. They wanted them to come off charging. They needed to fight. And so he came up with this idea, or he had his engineers come up with this plan. And it's kind of a ridiculous plan. But here's what they decided they would do. They were going to take all of their boats, and they were going to lash them together. And they made a bridge out of all of these boats that their soldiers could then move across. Now, have you ever tried to walk in a boat? Has anybody fallen out of a boat while trying to walk in a boat? I've nearly fallen out of a boat walking in a boat. So imagine being arrayed in armor, and you're nervous because you're getting ready to fight the Greeks. And you're now going to march with all of your buddies. Have you ever tried to walk in a boat with somebody else walking in a boat at the same time? So you can imagine how precarious this is to begin with. Well, as they're getting ready to cross over, storm comes in. Rains come down. Winds blow. What happens to the ocean when a storm comes in? Waves. Big waves. Big waves. So the ocean gets all churning, wavy, and this bridge collapses. It comes apart. How do we think Xerxes reacts? Not well. That's probably the understatement of this whole class. Remember you said that, not well. Let's see how not well that he reacts. He gets so mad that he orders that the sea be flogged 300 times. Volatile. Is that reasonable? What was that, Robert?
It didn't accomplish much.
It didn't accomplish much. Maybe made him feel better. I don't know. So he had the sea flogged. But he didn't stop there. He then had them heat hot pokers so that they could brand the sea. Now, if you have a hot iron, what do you cool it off in? Volatile. Reasonable? No. But that was his order. But he didn't stop there. He was so mad. First, he took out his anger and his vengeance at the sea. Then, I told you, he had his engineers come up with this plan. Well, he had all of them executed as well. Because, obviously, they should have been in control of the weather, right? Volatile. Very, very dangerous individual. So, when we look at the records that we have from history that talk about the behavior of Xerxes and how he was just not quite sane. He reacts to things in extreme ways, unreasonable ways. When we look at the book of Esther and we look at this king Ahasuerus and we see some of the just extreme ways that he goes about things, it matches up in personality. So maybe this is just a trait of Persian kings. That could be. It very well could be that any of them would be as impulsive as this. But we see from the historical records, there's a good chance that this is who we're talking about. All right. Any thoughts or comments so far? I'm very much a conversationalist kind of instructor. I also talk with my hands, if you haven't noticed. So if you have comments, please jump in. I would much rather us have discussion than you just have to sit and listen to me. All right, let's talk about the purpose of the book, then. So why in the world do we have the book of Esther? Every book in the Bible has a purpose. You think about reading the Bible, it's a big book. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, a lot of pages. But if you stop and think about the magnitude of God, the Bible doesn't have much to say, really. So every book matters. Every book counts. Every word, every page is important. So why do we have the book of Esther? What are we going to find in it? So one of the biggest things we see in the book of Esther is it demonstrates how God provides for his people, how he is able to preserve people. He had preserved the Israelites when they went into captivity. They went into captivity in very bad circumstances. They could have been wiped out during that time. God carried them through. During the events of the book of Esther, the entire nation is at risk of elimination. By the end of the book, it could be that every Israelite is going to be murdered. And yet we see that's not how it plays out. God cares for his people throughout the entire book. God is going to show this book's going to show faithfulness from God's people. It's going to show courage from God's people. And it's going to show how those can overcome danger or peril, if you will. I mentioned that scepter that had to be raised up. Esther was in great danger of death. The Israelites were in tremendous danger of extinction. And yet we see wonderful examples of courage, of having faith, even though it doesn't mention God explicitly. There's obvious faith at play. So that's very important when we look at this book. And again, that comes full circle to us. We live in a time where we can't just speak to God and expect a verbal answer. Now, do not take that to mean I say God is not speaking to us. God speaks to us. He truly does. Every time we read his Bible, he is speaking to us. When we pray, we meditate, God is communicating with us. But we're not going to walk by the bush that is on fire and in speaking. We're not going to walk by a prophet who is speaking out the words of God. It's very different. We live in a time where this matters for these examples. Another purpose of the book is there's a Jewish feast, the Feast of Purim. And this book is going to explain where in the world that came from. They maintain this feast. And so this tells us how it came about. And so I've got a reference here to chapter 9 of the book of Esther. So we'll just read that right quick. So if you would turn to the book of Esther, we're going to go to 9:20 through 22. Esther 9:20 through 22. It says, And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews, near and far, who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month from which which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So it's the establishment right there of this feast, of this holiday. So it tells us where that came from. So that is important when, again, we start talking about historical records that prove the Bible is accurate, that proves that it is true. The Jews have this Feast of Purim. Well, where did it come from? Well, it had to come from somewhere. Right here, we have the record in history how that came about. Now, I said that the Israelites had been taken into captivity. Another word that we use for that is exile. The enemies of God, which at the time the Babylonians, they came in, they swept away the Israelites. They took them into captivity. Did that ruin God's plans? Not at all. Not at all. In fact, it was God's plan that that was going to happen. So what we're going to see in this book, that even in extremely difficult times, even exile, taken from their home, God's plans are not thwarted. That's very important for us today. We live in this world where we have free will. We make decisions. We're able to do good things. We're able to do bad things. Many people choose to do horrible things. A lot of the things that the Babylonians did were very, very bad things. They killed people. They dragged them off into slavery. Not what we typically think of as a good thing. But God used those events in a very positive way. When we struggle, when we run into issues, when people do bad things, we have to remember God is always in control. We may not see it immediately. When you are at ground level and you see the raiders coming over the hill and dragging people off, you think God has forsaken them. Not so. God preserved his people. God saved his people. So it's an important book that we see God's able to operate even in the worst of human times. And we use terms like that. When were the worst of human times? People, yeah. Are you thinking right now? Are you thinking back then? Like
Always.
always. Yeah. So a lot of times we look back and we're like, man, things were so bad back then. But then we look around and we say, man, things are bad right now. Well, we live in a broken and sinful world. Things are always going to be bad to some extent. And somewhere in the world, horrible things are going to be happening. But God is always in control. God is always working for the salvation of his people. Now, does that mean that God saved everybody from harm? Does that mean he saved everybody from dying? No. I think Hiram said the other day in one of his sermons, he said, God will get us through. He doesn't get us around things. He doesn't prevent things from happening to us, but he provides a way for us to get through things. And we see that here. His people got through these struggles. So that's what we're going to see in the book of Esther. All right, so the book is not just a book without God's name. But if we get in trivia night and we get challenged on that, what is our answer? We're going to call a friend. Perfect timing. You phone a friend. What do we say? If somebody says, well, yeah, look, I've got a Bible. It talks about God. Somebody beefed it up. Yeah, we're going to use Roger's term. Somebody beefed it up. Yeah, but we got to be careful saying that because that sounds like we agree with doing that. It sounds like a positive. But yeah, we now know, okay, at some point somebody added to that text. And that is really a good opportunity to speak to someone about the importance of going to the original text, going to truth, not adding to. We can talk about that in the context of the Bible and transition right into religious practice. How many religious beliefs out there? Look at all the churches around. How many of them have added to or taken away from God's Word? So if we end up, now we're armed with another little tool in our toolbox where if somebody were to say, well, what about this? We have a transition now that we can talk about these things with them. We're going to see that this is a book where God's unseen hand, or at least unspoken hand, is going to move empires. Persia was one of the greatest empires of that time. And yet, God is going to be active in it. God's people are going to be having an impact in it throughout the entire book. And then we're going to see that this study, like I said, we're going to see how God's providence is there for us in our own hidden times. And I use that term hidden to talk about the idea of not having those flash bang kind of miracles. Let's talk about that for a minute. How many people say, well, why doesn't God still do these flashy kind of miracles? I would believe in God if I saw all of these flashy miracles. How do you respond to that if somebody tells you that?
He was doing flashy miracles back then, and then he even sent his son, and they still didn't pay attention to him.
Yeah. Jesus walked on water. Jesus raised the dead. What did they do to him? Nailed him to a tree. So people say today, well, I would believe it if it was flashy. It was flashy then. They didn't believe it then. Guess what? People haven't changed. They really haven't. Human behavior hasn't changed. Yes, sir.
Well, Jesus answered that question in front of the apostles when they asked him, show us the Father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Show us the Father. You've seen the Father. You've seen me. But so many people will now these days say, well, I didn't get to see Jesus. Well, how many people did see Jesus and still didn't believe him? That's not the answer. Yes, sir.
You also have that illustrated in the story of the rich man and Lazarus.
Mm-hmm.
He said, if they see people, he said, you send them back from the dead and they believe. He said, if they don't believe now, then I can believe then.
Yeah, absolutely. And we think about the timing of Jesus and all of these miracles. You know, I think about now, who remembers, and this is going to show my age, who remembers when David Copperfield made the Statue of Liberty disappear? Yeah, that was amazing, wasn't it? Yeah, truly amazing. It was magic. It was a miracle. It was trickery, right? We understand that it was trickery. Well, if Jesus were here right now performing miracles, what would people claim?
Magic.
It's trickery. Yeah, it's just it's staged. It's lighting. It's special effects. It's AI. Yes, thank you. It's AI. All of these things people can claim because we have all these ways to fool people and trick people. Well, and that's not new. I think back to the plagues of Egypt. Here's Moses doing all of these miraculous things, and what are the Egyptian sorcerers able to do? They're able to replicate many of the things. How? Because humans are clever. We are really good at fooling ourselves and other people. Magic, trickery. So this idea of needing to see things in a miraculous sense, that has never convinced everyone fully. Does it convince some who see it? Yes. We see in Scripture where people saw miracles and they believed and were convinced. But we see so many more that weren't. They just weren't. So that's not the answer. So when we look around today, we're like, well, we don't have miracles. That's all right. That's okay. It wasn't 100% then. It wouldn't be 100% now. All right. Any other thoughts or comments on our intro lesson here? All right. Well, that's where we're going to wrap up tonight. We have just a couple of moments before the bell, so we timed that pretty well. Next week, we're going to start in the first book of Esther, or first chapter of Esther. And the way I've got this divided, if you look through your workbook, we're going to try to cover a chapter every single session. Now, I know I get off on tangents and ramble, so we've got a little bit of wiggle room there. So if we need to carry over one week or the other, we will. But that's kind of the plan, is to go through one each week. And we'll pick up with chapter 1 next week.